Oscar, step away from the inventory table for me.
On what grounds exactly are we doing this?
Once is a mistake, twice is suspicious. Oscar Dewhurst did this 360 times across 4 years and signed his name to every single one of them.
The firearms listed as destroyed and released from your vault.
Access to these records doesn't prove who handled any of those weapons.
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what fence. I want a lawyer. Those were the last full sentences Sergeant Oscar Dewhurst spoke before federal agents walked him out of the parking lot of his fence's pawn shop. Within 72 hours, ATF would seize his service weapon, 2 personal laptops, a green ledger hidden behind a workbench drawer, and the keys to a vault he had supervised for 5 years. 360 firearms, 4 years, $620,000. The weapons he had been paid to guard were already circulating in 3 states, surfacing in narcotics busts, in carjackings, in 2 homicides that detectives had not yet connected to a single sergeant in Velmont, Michigan. Pop quiz. How many of the firearms your local police seized last year are still inside the evidence vault where they're supposed to be? Drop a number in the comments. Subscribe if you're new here. We cover accountability cases every week, and this one is going to make you look at your local department's property room a little differently. Oscar Dewhurst was born in 1976 in Cairo, Michigan, a sugar beet town in the state's thumb. His father was a parts foreman at the General Motors plant in Bay City. His mother taught 4th grade at the local elementary school for 31 years. The Dewhurst household was orderly in the way Midwestern industrial households of that decade tended to be. Dinner at 6, lawn mowed on Saturday mornings, a pegboard above the workbench in the garage where every wrench had its silhouette traced in black marker, so a missing tool would announce itself the moment the garage light came on. Firearms were part of that order from the beginning. His father kept a Remington Model 700 and a Mossberg pump in a locked steel cabinet bolted to the studs behind the basement furnace. Oscar shot his first whitetail at 12 on opening day of the November rifle season on a leased 40 in Tuscola County. By the time he was 16, his father had taught him to break down, clean, and reassemble every long gun in the cabinet, and the family rule was that no firearm went back into the cabinet until it had been wiped down, the bore had been run with a brass brush, and the bolt had been set aside on a clean shop towel. He graduated from Cairo High School in 1994. He worked construction for 2 summers, framing pole barns for a contractor named Ernie Vasek, who paid in cash on Fridays out of a leather pouch in his glove box. He thought briefly about following his father into the GM plant. He filed an application instead with the Velmont Police Department in the spring of 1996, after a recruiter visited the community college where he was taking criminal justice courses 2 evenings a week. The Velmont Police Department hired him in October 1996. He was 20 years old. He completed the Mid-Michigan Regional Police Academy in 22 weeks at the training center off M46. His academy evaluations described him as reliable, mechanically inclined, attentive to procedural detail. One instructor wrote that recruit Dewhurst shows particular aptitude for evidence handling and documentation protocols. That phrase would appear in his personnel file 4 more times across his career, copied forward by supervisors who had read his previous evaluations and saw no reason to write new ones. Velmont, Michigan, is a city of just under 60,000 people sitting along the Saginaw River. It has a downtown that emptied out in the 1980s and a strip of big box retail along the bypass that filled in afterward. The police department employs 94 sworn officers and a civilian support staff of about 30. It is the kind of department where most careers happen entirely inside the city limits and where promotions go to officers who do not embarrass the chief. Oscar Dewhurst spent his first 8 years on patrol. He worked the overnight shift on the city's east side for 4 of those years, then transferred to days. His evaluations from that period were uniformly positive. Detail-oriented. Consistently meets expectations. Demonstrates initiative on property-related calls. He married Heather Donnelly, a billing clerk at Velmont Regional Hospital, in 2001. Their son Cole was born in 2004. They bought a 3-bedroom ranch on Birchwood Drive in 2005, 15 minutes from the station, with a finished basement. Oscar slowly turned into his workshop. In 2014, he was promoted to corporal and assigned to the Property and Evidence Division as a working supervisor. The promotion came with a $5,000 raise and a small office off the evidence intake corridor. In 2020, he was promoted again, this time to sergeant, with primary administrative authority over the entire evidence storage facility. The promotion was not contested. He had been quietly running the division for years. There was nothing in his file that should have raised an alarm. There were no civilian complaints, no internal affairs referrals. He coached his son's youth hockey team for 4 winters at the Belmont Civic Arena. He served 2 terms on the Knights of Columbus Charity Board. His annual evaluations used the same vocabulary year after year: reliable, detail-oriented, trustworthy. That last word would matter. The Belmont Police Department Evidence Facility occupies the basement and sub-basement of the main station on Court Street. The facility is divided into 3 zones. The general property room holds non-firearm seized items, narcotics, electronics, cash, biological evidence. The biohazard and drug vault is climate-controlled and double-locked. The firearms vault is a separate single-purpose room measuring roughly 15 by 20 feet, with concrete walls, a steel door, and racks running floor to ceiling. On the day Oscar Dewhurst took over the division in 2014, the firearms vault held just over 2,000 weapons. The vault inventory broke down into 3 operational categories. Active case weapons were firearms held as evidence in open criminal prosecutions. They were tagged with their case number, the seizing officer's badge number, and the date of intake. They could not be moved without a documented chain of custody transfer. Recovered property weapons were firearms recovered as stolen and awaiting return to their lawful owners. Court disposition pending weapons were the 3rd category and the largest by volume. They were firearms whose original criminal cases had closed, but whose final legal disposition had never been completed. The court disposition pending category was the institutional graveyard of the firearms vault. Some of the weapons had been there for 15 years. A defendant pleaded out, and the firearm was never formally ordered destroyed. A complainant moved away and never claimed the recovered pistol. A case was dismissed, and the prosecutor's office never returned the disposition order. In every instance, the gun stayed in the vault, racked, tagged, and institutionally invisible. Every firearm in the vault had a sequential inventory identifier, a paper intake form, and a digital record in the property management software. Every disposition, whether destroyed, released to claimant, or transferred to another agency, was supposed to be entered into the system with a corresponding signed form, a witnessing officer's badge number, and, for destructions, a certificate from the regional disposal contractor. Periodic stock counts were conducted twice a year by the same evidence division staff who worked under the sergeant in charge. That sergeant was Oscar Dewhurst. He set the audit schedule. He assigned the counters. He reviewed the reconciliation reports. He signed off on every disposition entry. The system was designed under the assumption that the person supervising the audit was not the person stealing the inventory. That assumption was the only structural defense the system had, and it was about to be tested. The first weapon left the vault in March 2021. It was a Glock 19, 9th generation, recovered in a 2017 narcotics raid, court disposition pending, since the defendant had taken a federal plea 2 years earlier. The original case file noted no claimant and no destruction order. The weapon had been in the same rack location for 46 months. Sergeant Dewhurst pulled it from the rack at the end of his shift, slipped it into a soft case in his department-issued duffel, and walked out the back service entrance to his personal vehicle in the staff lot. The fence was a man named Lucas Brannigan, who operated a pawn shop and small arms reseller called Saginaw Valley Trade on the south side of Belmont. Brannigan was not formally licensed for the kind of transactions he was conducting with Dewhurst. He moved weapons through a network of regional buyers, straw purchasers, out-of-state resellers, two known affiliates of a Detroit area trafficking crew that supplied weapons into the Chicago illegal market. He had been introduced to Dewhurst 3 years earlier through a mutual acquaintance who ran a hunting guide service in Tuscola County. The first meeting was, on its face, social. The second meeting was business. Brannigan paid $400 for that first Glock. He sold it 3 weeks later to a buyer in Gary, Indiana, for $1,100. The buyer's identity would not be established for almost 4 years. 2 weeks after the first removal, Dewhurst sat at his terminal in the evidence office and entered a disposition record. Item 17-4429, Glock 19 9mm, status updated to destroyed per policy, with the date of disposal and the certificate number field populated with a fabricated string of digits. He certified the entry himself under his own login. There was no requirement that a second supervisor witness the disposition for court disposition pending items in the destroyed category. The system was built that way because the people who built the system did not imagine the supervising sergeant as a threat. The method did not vary. He targeted the court disposition pending backlog almost exclusively because those weapons had no active claimant who might call asking about them. He preferred weapons that had been in the vault for more than 3 years because the original case officer was likely retired, transferred, or simply not paying attention. He pulled small numbers per month, never more than 10, usually 4 to 7. He spaced his disposition entries across days and weeks so that no single batch of destroyed per policy updates would draw an auditor's eye. He kept a green spiral-bound ledger in his basement workshop, behind a drawer in the workbench. Each entry was a date, an inventory ID, a make and model, and a price. $400, $500, $800. By the second year, he was averaging 15 weapons a month. By the third year, he was selling AR pattern rifles for $2,200 apiece and a single FN-57 for $2,800. He paid down the mortgage on the Birchwood Drive house in early 2022. He paid off Heather's Toyota in cash that summer. He paid for his son's hockey travel team and the team's annual tournament trip to Toronto without taking out a loan. He bought a 16-foot aluminum fishing boat with a 40-horse Yamaha outboard and a tandem axle trailer. He paid for it in cash at a dealership in Bay City and asked the salesman not to put his name on the marketing list. Nobody noticed. Nobody checked. The Evidence Division civilians who worked under him conducted the periodic stock counts using the inventory software that listed every destroyed per policy weapon as resolved and removed from the active count. The counts always reconciled. They reconciled because the inventory was lying, and the inventory was lying because Sergeant Dewhurst had certified the lies himself. The catalyst came from outside Velmont. In the spring of 2024, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, in coordination with the Michigan State Police Firearms Investigations Unit, opened a regional trafficking case targeting a Detroit area distribution network. The case was built around a cooperating informant inside the network who had agreed to identify upstream suppliers in exchange for a reduced sentence on an unrelated federal charge. A TF recovered weapons. They recovered them from controlled buys, from search warrants on stash houses, from arrests during traffic stops on I-94 and I-75. Every recovered firearm was traced through the ATF National Tracing Center in West Virginia, where federal regulations require manufacturers, importers, and dealers to report the chain of legitimate disposition for every weapon they handle. The trace request goes in. The database returns the answer. The answer began to come back the same way. Last documented institutional custody, Velmont Police Department evidence intake. Date of intake, 2017, then 2015, then 2019, then 2014. The weapons should have been in the vault. They were not in the vault. They were in trafficking network recovery points across Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. The cluster grew. By July 2024, the ATF field office in Detroit had identified 11 recovered firearms whose serial number traces returned to Velmont Police Department evidence intake records. By September, the number was 23. The investigators noticed that none of the affected weapons appeared on the active Velmont evidence inventory. Every single one of them had been logged as released to lawful claimant, or more frequently, destroyed per policy. The ATF agent in charge, a special agent named Dana Vaillancourt, reviewed the trace cluster and made a decision that shaped the rest of the case. She did not contact Velmont Police Department Internal Affairs. She did not notify the chief. She did not request a courtesy meeting with the Evidence Division supervisor, whose disposition records were producing the impossible pattern. Instead, she contacted the Velmont City Attorney's Office directly and asked for a formal joint covert investigation, run entirely outside the Velmont PD chain of command. The city attorney agreed. The Michigan State Police Firearms Investigations Unit assigned 2 detectives to the joint task. The covert investigation opened in October 2024. For the next 4 months, federal agents pulled Velmont's complete firearms disposition database and audited it against the actual physical vault inventory, against the regional disposal contractor's certificate of destruction records, and against the cooperating informant's growing list of upstream sources. 360 weapons did not match. We're heading into the part of this case where the investigators close in, and the way they use the federal trace database is the part most people never see. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't look away from these stories. Subscribe. We break down the documentary structure of cases like this every week, and the way this one ends is worth seeing all the way through. The audit was not subtle to anyone who understood the system. 360 firearms recorded as destroyed per policy produced no matching certificate from the regional disposal contractor. That contractor, by binding agreement with the city of Velmont, picked up firearms for destruction at a foundry outside Lansing twice each year. The contractor's own records showed approximately 400 Velmont destructions across the 4-year window. The Velmont database showed approximately 760. The discrepancy was 360. The investigators built the case backward from there. Every destroyed per policy entry not matched to a contractor certificate was flagged. The flagged entries were cross-referenced against the ATF trace cluster, and the trace cluster matched the flagged entries to a degree no investigator on the joint task had seen before. The weapons were not just missing, they were missing in a pattern, and the pattern terminated at a single login certifying every disposition. The login belonged to Sergeant Oscar Dewhurst. A TF and MSP placed the fence, Lucas Brannigan, under surveillance in late November 2024. They watched Saginaw Valley trade for 3 weeks. They identified Dewhurst's personal vehicle, a black Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck, in the rear lot of Brannigan's shop on 2 separate occasions, both at the end of Dewhurst's shift. They photographed Dewhurst entering Brannigan's shop through the back service door, carrying a soft-sided rifle case in his right hand. In December 2024, Brannigan was approached by federal agents at his home. Confronted with the surveillance, the trace data, and the prospect of a federal trafficking indictment that would expose him to decades in custody, Brannigan agreed to cooperate within 90 minutes of the agents arriving at his front door. He provided text messages, voice notes, payment records, and a 4-year history of transactions with Dewhurst. He agreed to wear a wire. The text exchanges entered the case file in evidence. Brannigan, April 14, 2023. Client looking for an AR-15 budget around $2K, let me know what you got coming. Dewhurst, April 14, 2023. Have 2 in the pile, both 2017 cases, destroyed paperwork ready. Brannigan, April 16, 2023. Tomorrow, 6 p.m., same spot. Dewhurst, April 17, 2023. Running late shift over by 6:45. Brannigan, October 2, 2023. Need 4 by Friday handguns. Dewhurst, October 3, 2023. Can do but staggering paperwork over 2 weeks, don't push. Brannigan, February 11, 2024. Kid in Chicago looking for a 5.7 full price. Dewhurst, February 12, 2024. 1 in inventory, haven't touched it in 6 years, easy pull. The smoking gun was already in the federal database. The trace data was unambiguous. 360 firearms whose last documented institutional custody was Velmont's evidence vault were appearing at trafficking network recovery points, with no plausible legitimate disposition between intake and recovery. The federal regulatory architecture that exists precisely to make weapons traceable had been the documentary structure that ended the case. The investigators set the controlled buy for the third week of January 2025. The controlled buy ran on January 21st, 2025. Brannigan, wearing a wire and carrying marked currency, approached Dewhurst through the established channel with a request for a specific firearm. A Sig Sauer P226, court disposition pending since 2018, still racked in the Velmont vault under inventory ID 18-7715. Dewhurst pulled the weapon from the rack at 5:42 p.m. He certified a destroyed per policy entry in the inventory system at 6:18 p.m. under his own login. He met Brannigan in the rear parking lot of Saginaw Valley Trade at 7:04 p.m. The transaction took less than 2 minutes. Brannigan handed him $1,600 in marked currency. Dewhurst handed him the soft case containing the SIG. A TF agents and Michigan State Police detectives moved on Dewhurst's vehicle as he was pulling out of the lot. The body cam captured the next 90 seconds. Special Agent Vaillancourt. Sergeant Dewhurst, ATF. Step out of the vehicle, hands where I can see them. Dewhurst, hands on the steering wheel, looking straight forward. What is this about? Vaillancourt. Step out of the vehicle, sir. Dewhurst, slow, deliberate, hands still on the wheel. I'm a Velmont police sergeant. Whatever you think this is, you're going to want to call my chief. Vaillancourt. Your chief has already been notified. Step out of the vehicle. Dewhurst stepped out. The marked currency was in the passenger footwell. The empty soft case was on the back seat. His personal vehicle's GPS log was already in federal custody. The wire on Brannigan had captured the entire transaction. The SIG P226 was being processed by an MSP detective 50 feet away. Dewhurst, cuffed, looking at the ground. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what fence. I want a lawyer. Those were the last full sentences he spoke to law enforcement. The search warrant for the Birchwood Drive residence was executed at 9:14 p.m. the same evening. Agents found the green spiral-bound ledger behind the workbench drawer in the basement workshop. They found $23,000 in cash inside a fishing tackle box on the garage shelving. They found 2 laptops, 3 external hard drives, and a cell phone whose text history matched the records already in federal custody. The ledger itself was a 4-year record of every transaction, 347 entries, each with a date, an inventory ID, a make and model, and a price. The total at the bottom of the last filled page was $617,400. The federal forensic accountants would refine the figure to approximately $620,000 once additional unrecorded cash transactions were traced through Brannigan's records. A federal grand jury returned a 31-count indictment against Sergeant Oscar Dewhurst on February 11, 2025. The charges included theft of firearms from a public agency under Michigan compiled laws, Section 750, 357B, receipt and trafficking of stolen firearms under 18 U.S.C., Section 922J, making false entries in firearms records under 18 U.S.C., Section 924A, honest services wire fraud under 18 U.S.C., Section 1346, and misconduct in office under MCL Section 750. 505. The state counts were referred concurrently. The case was assigned to the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. Dewhurst was placed on unpaid administrative leave the morning of the indictment. His Velmont Police Department employment was terminated formally 6 weeks later, after a brief disciplinary process that his attorney did not contest. His pension contributions, after 19 years of service, were forfeit under Michigan statute governing public corruption convictions. His defense attorney, a Lansing-based federal defense specialist named Patricia Yarborough, has filed pretrial motions challenging the admissibility of the controlled buy recordings on Fourth Amendment grounds and seeking to suppress portions of the search warrant fruit on a technical chain of custody argument. The motions are pending. The case is scheduled for trial in the late autumn of this year. the downstream damage is harder to bound. The 360 firearms that left Velmont's vault are now circulating somewhere. Some have been recovered in the regional trafficking case that broke the investigation open. Most have not. ATF investigators have testified privately to the joint task that the recovered cluster, currently 29 weapons, likely represents under 10% of what is still in motion. The other 300-plus weapons will surface over the coming years in narcotics cases, in domestic violence calls, in homicide investigations, in carjackings, in self-inflicted deaths. Each surface event will trigger an ATF trace. Each trace will return the same answer. Last documented institutional custody, Velmont Police Department Evidence Vault. The Velmont City Council ordered a full external audit of the evidence facility in March 2025. The audit, conducted by a private forensic accounting firm at a cost of just over $400,000, identified additional procedural failures across the property and evidence division, extending back further than the 4-year theft window. The chief of police announced his retirement, effective at year-end. 2 civilian evidence division employees were terminated for the count reconciliations they had signed off on under Dewhurst's direction. The vault's locking architecture, audit protocol, and disposition certification process have all been rebuilt under state oversight. Sergeant Oscar Dewhurst, who spent 19 years inside the institution that was supposed to keep these weapons out of circulation, is currently free on a $500,000 bond. He is required to surrender his passport, to report weekly to pretrial services, and to stay within the Eastern District of Michigan. He is not permitted to possess a firearm. The man who controlled the largest single firearms inventory in his county for 5 years is now, by federal court order, prohibited from touching one. This case is still unresolved, but the case on the right-hand side of your screen is one that already closed, and what came out of that courtroom is going to stay with you.